All right, hi everybody. I'm Sarah Adair. I'm a Senior Policy Associate at the Climate and Energy Program at the Nicholas Institute. I have the great pleasure this afternoon of introducing our next panel, which I think was really teed up very nicely by our first session this morning and our lunchtime talk just now. So we heard a lot this morning about how low-cost natural gas, renewables, other factors are changing the markets. And evolving state policy priorities, diverse policy priorities among the various states in the PJM region. We also heard from Chairman Hawk this morning that noting that PJM has really taken up this question of how to make state policy priorities and the markets work well together. So we're going to hear a little bit more about one of the proposals or ideas. I'll let Darlene in a moment tell you what the technical term is for some of the ideas that PJM has put out there that to address the capacity market in particular. So our task in this session is to hear a little bit more about that proposal, what's motivating it, unpack it a little bit, and think about how that proposal and some of the other ideas that might be on the table relate back to some of the issues that were raised by our state regulators this morning. So I have a really tremendous set of panelists to help me do that. Immediately to my right, Darlene Phillips, Director of Strategic Policy and External Affairs at PJM. To her right, Kathleen Barron, Senior Vice President for Federal Affairs and Competitive Market Policy at Exelon. To Kathleen's right, Pete Fuller, Vice President of Market and Regulatory Affairs at NRG Energy. And then last but certainly not least, Marissa Gillette, who is Senior Advisor to the Chairman of the Maryland Public Service Commission. So for the format for this, I'm going to turn it over to Darlene in just a moment, and I'm going to give her use of the slides and ask her to come up to the podium and spend maybe just a few more minutes, 5 to 10 minutes here, talking a little bit about that proposal to get it out on the table. I know many of you are very familiar with it, maybe some of you less familiar with it. So to talk through what PJM has put forward for stakeholders and states to consider. And then I will ask our other panelists to offer about 5 minutes of introductory remarks. Then I'll ask some questions, try to get a discussion going among the folks up here at the front, and we'll save about 20 minutes to the end for you all to get involved and ask your questions and offer your comments, including those of you at home. So I think Franz will be manning the Twitter feed and our online submission. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Darlene, and we'll get started.
Thank you. Is the mic on? Can you guys hear me? Okay. You notice I don't have a name tag. My hypothesis is they found out that I was a University of Michigan grad. Trust me, it's just as difficult for me being in Columbus as it is for you having me here. But we'll move on. I digress a little bit. Before I get started and to talk specifically about our proposal, I just want to spend a little bit of time, just a little bit of time, talking a little bit about why we're doing this. I thought the morning panel did an excellent job of laying out why we're here, why we're having this discussion. So there are 3 main points I want to make sure that I hit on during my discussion with you, my 5 to 10 minutes discussion with you. One is to really show you why this issue is real and important to us, and why everyone who's interested in discussion really should remain at the table and focus on collectively finding a solution to it. The second is to understand that even though there are extremes to how we approach a solution to the issue, we at PJM tried to take a more balanced approach to the issue, really balancing the benefits that you get out of the markets, the existing markets, as well as accommodating state policy. And the third is, where do we go from here? So with that, let's see here. There we go. It is going forward. Can you see that? There we go. I won't spend a lot of time talking about this. I think the first several speakers laid out that there's been a big change in where we were 10 years ago, but as to where we are today. But one of the things that I think is really important to this discussion is the fact that that our markets today are functioning well. They are delivering the value and the benefits that we set out to deliver. At the time the markets were designed, there were really two main objectives. It was reliability at the lowest cost. Today, we're dealing with a lot more than we did at the time the markets were developed. So naturally, we have to adjust as the times adjust, as the states adjust to their state policy. I think on the first panel, you heard that there's a number of reasons why states might, and others might want to implement policy for economic reasons, for carbon reasons, and none of this was contemplated in the initial design of the markets, which is why we're having the conversation today. So the question that we ask ourselves is, how do we accommodate this public policy while still maintaining the billions of dollars of annual benefits that we have, that we provide today to the larger region? This map shows why this is important to PJM. So surely Illinois has already implemented state policy, ZEC legislation, but we know that there are several other states where this conversation is taking place, and so that makes it even more of an issue and more important for us to make sure that we are being proactive and moving forward to accommodate these policies before they distort the markets. So when I say distort the markets, the issue that we are trying to solve specifically at PJM is one of price suppression. Probably about 18 months ago, we rolled out an analysis that showed that our markets were functioning as designed. We were effectively signaling to resources new entry and exit into our markets, which means that generation was being built when and where it was needed at the time, and maybe older technology resources or non-economic resources were exiting from our footprint. So that was happening effectively. We want to make sure that that continues to happen. So what happens under normal circumstances when we settle our capacity, when we run our capacity market solution, what you'll see in this example is we'll get we'll set the supply and the price in one particular solution. In this particular example, you see us at $35. It worked. So when you inject out-of-market payments, resource owners really are incented to bid a little lower than they otherwise would have bid into the competitive market. So what you see is that the subsidized resources come to the front of the stack, and you see otherwise competitive resources move to the end of the stack and don't get selected under normal conditions should we do nothing to our markets. And under normal circumstances, there's a couple of points that I want to make. Under normal circumstances, low prices are good. I think this is the first time in history where we are one of many that are kind of figuring out what we do with the lower prices. But here's why it's important. In the short term, it really puts added pressure on existing non-subsidized resources, especially those ones that are on the margin, right, just to the left of the solution. It really puts a lot of pressure on them to figure out how they make up the rest of their money, or whether or not they go in and ask for a subsidy. In the long run, it affects resource adequacy. One of the things that I noted earlier is that we effectively signal entry and exit into the markets. If we are not given the right price signals for entry into the market over the long haul, it could have adverse effects on resource adequacy across our region. So that's another reason why this is really important for us to solve. So what is our solution? This slide looks a lot more complicated than it actually is. So let me take you through it. What we propose is that instead of doing one solution whereby we set the megawatts and the price in what solution, we break it down in two stages. The first stage would run it as normal. So in this particular instance, it would be on the left, stage one would set the quantity. And what you see is what it would set is a quantity based on the existing offers at a price of $35. Now note, what you see on the bottom to the left are the subsidized units, because they were incentivized to bid a little lower than they would have otherwise bid. In order to get the correct price, or I shouldn't say correct price, a price that's more reflective of what the true competitive price might be, in the second stage, we would provide an offer to those subsidized units that is more reflective of the competitive price, rerun the algorithm, and then set the price. It's important to keep in mind that all of the units would get the price that is set in the second stage, and in this case, it would be the $40 price. So a couple of things to note in this particular example. Oh, I saw something move, sorry. A couple of things to note in this particular example. Those units that did not, that were not a part of the quantity setting stage will not get a capacity payment. The only people or the only resources that will get a capacity payment are those resources that cleared in stage 1. So even though they are part of what would have been, but for the subsidized units bidding artificially low, they still do not get an offer. Those are the marginal units that are pushed out of the stack. Any questions so far? Okay. One of the other things that I want to note is that as part of our proposal, one of the things that we did is to talk through what might trigger a repricing mechanism. What we are concerned about are those subsidies that have a material impact on the market. And I know that material can be debated in many different ways, and we are open to that discussion. We took a stab at what that might look like when we set forth our proposal, but we understand that that is certainly something that is up for discussion. One of the things we want to make sure that happens is that whichever approach is selected through our stakeholder process also has a large and thorough discussion on what those triggers ought to be when we're, that trigger the repricing approach. And finally, where do we go from here? So one of the things that we're doing at PJM is we have instituted a stakeholder process called the capacity, this is a hard one, Capacity Construct Public Policy Senior Task Force. It is a mouthful. One of the things that we undertook as part of that effort is to bring all of the stakeholders to the table to help us decide what we might do to mitigate subsidies or certain subsidies within the PJM footprint so that the markets remain viable and they are not distorted with these subsidies. Right now, there are 10 or so proposals that are being evaluated. Last week, there was a vote on those proposals, and I think the analysis or the results of those votes will be rolled out. It's important to note that many of them were consistent with what PJM put forth. What you see is some small differences in what you do with what we call those sort of stranded resources that were kind of pushed out of the stack. From the subsidized resources. And so there are a couple of proposals that try to address that, and there are a couple of proposals that say, well, you know, maybe there should be different triggers that we use in order to bring forth the repricing approach. And so what we want to do is to make sure that we continue the discussions. Certainly we believe that this is a problem or an issue that should be solved, and we understand that it's going to take all of us in order to be able to solve it effectively. With that, I'll turn it over to Kathleen.
Thank you, Charlene. I'm going to pick up from a slightly different place and take a step back. But just starting from the premise that a number of folks this morning have acknowledged that, you know, the markets that we have right now are designed to achieve reliability at the least cost. That's a pretty unremarkable thing to say, but I do think it's important to state the opposite of that, which is that environmental performance matters. We have a number of ways to try to gauge environmental performance and incentivize environmental performance. This afternoon's panel will talk about the tax the thing you don't like model, some sort of carbon pricing. What we're talking about here is when states have chosen the opposite way to do that, which is to incentivize the thing they do like, to incent new clean generation to come in or existing clean generation to stay. The premise of this entire section of today is that that's an illegitimate way to go forward, and we should do something about that because it's somehow interfering with these markets that we've set up and causing them to achieve or to result in outcomes that are not acceptable. And you know, I do not agree with that perspective. I think that states have the ability to choose either of those two paths, whether it's a carbon pricing scheme or a supporting existing clean and new clean through support payments. But the premise of this discussion is that one is better than the other, and that we should be concerned about the model that is using support payments to decarbonize or reduce emissions. And the point is somehow that we are seeing results in the market that are going to undermine its purpose. And I thought Darlene did a beautiful job of explaining the proposal that PJM has put forward, and I think PJM has shown great leadership in trying to put something out there if we need to have some sort of market change to counteract what states are doing when they're choosing that path of supporting clean generation. What should that look like? But I think we need to take it one step further than the conclusion that supporting units through state support payments is going to suppress prices. Because the question is, why does that matter? I understand why NRG doesn't like that. I understand why Exelon might not like that. AEP might not like that. But why should you not like that? And just to take it, again, one step further, I think, as I've asked that question, the answer I get back is, well, if we don't have the right level, the perception that we do not have the right level of pricing in the capacity market, we're not going to have existing resources stay in the system that would otherwise stay. And so we'll have inefficient retirement, and we won't attract new resources into the system. But the point there is we do have a demand curve in PJM. If we have resources that are hesitant to bid their cost, whether they're in the system or coming into the system, we're not going to let the system not clear. We're not going to let the system not be resource adequate. The price can go up to the cost of new entry. It can even go above the cost of new entry if we have a reserve shortage. And that's the real concern, is that the prices are going to spike because new investors in new generation or owners of existing generation are going to be pricing the risk of future subsidy programs into their bids. The prices are going to go up too high. That is going to be unacceptable to stakeholders, and it's going to undermine the market so much so that people start to leave the market. I mean, I think that's really the argument, is that we're going to, in the end, see prices that are too high, and that's not going to be sustainable. It's not that we won't have a resource adequate system. We've designed it so that we're going to have resource adequacy, but we're going to see prices that are too high, and that's going to destabilize this long-term, 20-plus year effort that we've put into using markets to meet customer demand. So having that in mind, let's take a look at where we are. I did bring one slide that sort of sets I don't know how to move this forward. Do you know? I think it was right at the back of yours. There it is. That gives us a level set of where we are. Now, Darlene started her discussion of what the problem is that we're trying to solve here. She talked about the Illinois bill. But we can't start with the bill that passed in Illinois in December. This is a picture across all of the competitive markets, the Eastern RTOs, of what the footprint looks like in terms of units that are getting support from the state. And I've been exceedingly generous in this slide when I depict in blue the number of units that are receiving support that are powered by nuclear power. The dark blue on the left is the actual amount of generation in PJM that is eligible for support under the Illinois program. It's about 1,400 megawatts out of a 170 gigawatt system. But the red are RPS, renewable programs that have been in place for years and years and years that are on the PJM today. And, excuse me, that's the green. I have a black and white version here. The red is, of course, traditionally regulated units that are on the PJM system. We heard earlier about a known statute that has a preference if the utilities in Virginia build. It's an in-state preference. There's rate regulation of those units. There's rate regulation of publicly owned. What we've seen in Illinois, which is, of course, the only state in PJM where there is a nuclear support program. So, and this plays out across the other RTOs as well. So we're not starting from a place where we don't have state support programs. We're not starting from a place where we haven't had people investing against this kind of backdrop. This is pretty common practice in PJM in greater about when we talk about nuclear programs. So this is a picture of just looking at what's on the we should expect to be on the system in 2025. And what have we seen so far in terms of investor reaction? In the last auction, we had 2.4 gigawatts of new generation entering the PJM system at a price a fraction of what the cost of new entry is. So we have people against the backdrop of all of this existing state-supported generation and against the backdrop of the Illinois legislation, which had passed 5 months before that auction, of investment coming into the system at a very reasonable price. So what does that tell us? To us, it tells us two things. One is that we don't have a problem right now. There was some polling, as Darlene mentioned, in the PJM CCPP STF, and there were a number of questions there that went to the validity of the various proposals, including PJM's, NRG's, ours, others. But what was telling, I thought, is that when pollers were asked to rate the different proposals and what their first and second choice was, 73% of the respondents picked either as their first or second choice the status quo. They're not seeing the sort of impact on the market that would justify doing a wholesale redo of how we set price in RPM. They're just not seeing the need for it. But the second thing it tells us is, let's assume the sort of parade of horribles is true, and these policies are going to proliferate, and we're going to see way more than this amount of state-supported generation over time. We're going to see it everywhere. Well, what should we do about that? How should we know when too much is enough? And that's sort of where we break down with some of the existing proposals that are on the table, because we find that they're just arbitrary. I mean, the PJM proposal, and as I said, I give PJM a lot of credit for trying to be thoughtful and be a leader and to put out something that is going to respect the various interests. But the triggers in the PJM proposal are arbitrary. As I don't know how you would identify that 1,000 megawatts of additional, in addition to this, additional subsidized resources is too much, but 999 is okay. In the PJM proposal, there's an exception for the PTC. So if a unit is just being supported by the federal production tax credit, which is $23 a megawatt hour, it's about double the cost of the ZEC credit in Illinois, that's not considered an actionable subsidy. Even though there's 3 or 4 times the amount of resources in PJM that are receiving the PTC than will be receiving a ZEC, even though the PTC is more than double what the ZEC is, that's not considered to be actionable. So you know, there's that set of concerns. Is if we're going to have triggers, they should be more closely tied to what we're trying to prevent, what the risk is that we think is caused by these programs. Another set of proposals have that set of concerns, but then they go a little bit further. And I know Pete will do a great job explaining NRG's proposal. All I'll say about it is that that proposal and a couple of others appear to fundamentally disagree that cleaner resources should earn more money than an emitting resource, which is, of course, the point of the state program in the first place, is trying to decarbonize through using some sort of support payment to keep clean generation in or new clean generation coming in. And those proposals have the effect of reversing the state policy. I mean, there's just no way to explain why you would intentionally have a resource class that the state has determined is preferred because it's cleaner, earn less money in the capacity market, ultimately earn nothing in the capacity market. That's the purpose of it. It's to reverse the effect of the state program and increase compensation for emitting resources back to the way that they would have been compensated had the state not had the decarbonization goal. So we did offer, you know, for the purpose of being constructive, an alternative proposal in the stakeholder process. And what we have suggested is that we have a trigger for repricing that is more tied to the purpose of what RPM is there for. If RPM is there to ensure that we can meet our customers' demands and maintain reliability, then what we should be doing is using that repricing tool when we're at that point. And so what we've proposed is a model where we would essentially use the structure PJM has come up with, where we would clear the market once based on units' original offers, And then we would see what that market would return if those units that are receiving state support were to be put into the market at a higher cost. And if that run shows you that the price in RPM is going up to a point where you should be concerned that price as a leading indicator of a potential reliability issue or a inability of the market to achieve its reserve margin, then and only then would you reprice the results in RPM and ask consumers to pay more. But if what you're seeing is people willing to stay in and come into the market at a reasonable cost, then there's really no reason to reprice the capacity market except for there are assets that feel like there's been some sort of what they would perceive as suppression that they don't like. But from a consumer's perspective, if you have resource adequacy at a reasonable cost, why are you going to raise the price? What are you getting for that? That's the question we're trying to answer with our counterproposal is we should only have repricing when we're at that point. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions.
Okay. Well, thanks to the folks at that organized this and invited us to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today. As Kathleen started to preview, I'll give you the spoiler alert. I'm going to tell you a slightly different story. And so it really has the following elements. There is a problem. There is a real problem in the markets and getting the markets to work constructively with the states and vice versa. Talk a little bit about what those proposals are and why the PJM repricing, NRG's repricing, something in that realm is probably, in our view, in the right sweet spot. And then talk a little bit about why that's only the first step in the journey that we have to go on here. Because there's a lot more that needs to be done as we think about transforming the grid to be low carbon, to sustain low carbon investment and operations, and really to support the kind of things that Mr. McCullough was talking about, the grid edge, the distributed resources, the virtual power plants, all of that kind of stuff in a low carbon, customer responsive way. There's a lot that needs to be done, and these repricing ideas are really just at the very beginning. But I wanted to start, if I could, and let me try this, very homely, domestic visual to see if it would resonate with you the way it does with me. And it has to do with loading the dishwasher, common chore that we all do. My wife and I, soulmates, we get along very, very well. We live together. We will stay together forever. We can't do this together. When it's my turn, when I'm doing it, I do it. And it's mine and it's my system. When she does it, it's her system. What I feel like we're dealing with here is the states collectively, 20 years ago through restructuring said, PJM, you load the dishwasher. Now, here we are, showing up with serving platters, with bowls, and saying, no, this has to go in there, this has to go in there, this has to go in there. So it's a homely and a silly example, but I think the point hopefully drives home that there is real tension there. There is a real problem there. Because PJM, the markets, in loading that dishwasher, in figuring out what the investment mix is, have a set of criteria, and that needs to be honored until we change it. And that's what I'll get to down the road. If we change those criteria from reliable at lowest cost, then it should still work. But it's in this intermediate time that we've got real tension, and there is a real problem if we're going to keep the market system working. So I had a bunch of thoughts on the background of the environment we're in, but I think a lot of this has been touched on. Certainly the abundance of gas, the inexpensiveness of gas, the effect of that on fuel choices in the market, the conversions from coal to gas, very much here, certainly more as you go farther north and east in the U.S., which leads to low margins, which leads to a lot of the energy market issues that we've heard about, and bleeds over from there. At the same time, you've got the specific initiatives to decarbonize, to spur renewables, both for the environmental benefits, but also for the economic benefits, the jobs, the new industries, the forward-thinking economic development. And as those things have been incentivized and encouraged, you've got technological advances, so inverters are doing a lot of things they weren't doing 5 or 10 years ago. You've got cost declines in solar, in wind, in storage that are, jaw-dropping when you think about how prices have come down in those technologies. So the idea that thinking about nuclear, coal, even gas combined cycles as the basis and the workhorse of the grid, I think is very much in question. And we have to be thinking about these new technologies and how they become the foundational elements of the grid. It was also mentioned earlier, the environmental regulatory, I'll call it inertia. As we know, the Clean Power Plan didn't go into effect, but it created a lot of inertia. The states doing studies and so forth, people planning for it, people thinking about it, the work in Virginia. MATs, other things that were on the books were moving, people acted, people anticipated. We've seen a lot of move in that direction to clean up the act, whether or not the regs actually went final. What that's all leading to is, part of that environment also is this move to more distributed resources, more renewables, both through direct action and because they're just becoming more economic. Corporate buyers of renewables, sponsoring wind farms, solar farms, what have you. And you're getting some of these results, the nuclear plants, the coal plants, seeking regulatory relief because the markets that they thought they were going into are not acting as the way they thought they would because of this fundamental technological and cost shifts that are going on. So with all that as background, thinking about the CCPP-STF, got it. Again, our view very strongly is thinking about the markets as all the benefits that have been talked about, from the centralized dispatch to ensuring that investments are made when and where it makes sense, and importantly, that the investments, the risk of those investments lies with the investors and the shareholders, not with ratepayers through long-term commitments under regulatory agreements. I think that's a key element we can't lose sight of. We look at that as really the important thing to preserve here is that construct and maintaining the ability for markets to work. So as we look across the CCPP-STF stuff, this is getting even better. Excuse me. On one extreme, we've got a proposal that really says the market is everything, and we want to apply the minimum offer price rule and sort of keep out anything that is not demonstrably economic in our market today, at one extreme. On the other extreme, we've got varying strains of there's no problem, everybody gets subsidies, so how are these any different? I think either of those is problematic in its own way. And that's why we came up with something, a little bit of a variant on what Darlene described in the PJM proposal. And what we saw about the PJM approach, because we brainstormed all of these ideas, came up with all of them, and winnowed it out to the one we came forward with over a year and a half ago in New England originally, is you get this problem of the resources that would be economic if you didn't have the subsidized resources coming in. But under the PJM proposal, for example, they would say, well, yeah, you would have been economic, but sorry, you didn't pass the first stage of our auction, so you're out. We see a lot of problems with that, and it's fairly technical, but how do people bid? How do they evaluate the risk? And how do they act if they're in that margin area? If I'm on that bubble of being tossed out by the new wind farm that is actually more expensive to me on a real pro forma basis, am I going to act? Am I going to just take that? Am I going to act differently? Am I going to shade my bid? Am I going to do something different? And risk of being thrown out, risk of changing prices is generally bad for the markets, bad for consumers. You want to manage risk. You want to give people risk that they can actually manage, not that kind of sort of open-ended risk. So we looked at it, our proposal in very brief. I didn't bring the slide. I won't bore you with that. But our proposal is, well, you've now created, if you do something very similar to PJM, you've created this extra resource set, if you will. Rather than throwing out units G and H, I think it was, and telling them that they've got nothing, we take the quantity that represents, and we kind of spread it across everybody. So you lose 5 megawatts, you lose 5 megawatts, you lose 5 megawatts. It's not perfect. It's not a really great outcome, but we think it has a lot of benefits in terms of both allowing the state-sponsored megawatts into the market and spreading that risk around so that the retirements that happen are going to be sort of the way they are today. When you come up with a new capital expenditure that has to happen and the market won't support it, or prices are just low and low enough that you just can't make it go anymore, that's when retirements are going to happen, not because you're being effectively pushed out by priority given to state-sponsored resources. And I'm sure I'm over time, and I apologize, but the two other things that I want to mention as far as where we need to go beyond this idea of accommodate, if you will, is really the first step. That's just to say the states are acting today. We want to provide a means for that to harmonize with the markets as they stand and put that in place so that we stanch the bleeding. Where I think we really need to go, and I know there's a panel later on carbon pricing, and that may be an element of it, is how do we build into the markets these objectives? Is it just carbon, which I think it largely is, but what else could we build into the markets constructively so that they actually do the job and the states are no longer incented or feel pressured to take these direct actions and insert themselves into the market? And I think that is a critically important piece that we shouldn't lose sight of, that this first step of the task force is just the first step, and there's a lot more work to be done. And then I would argue that a little farther over the horizon, but it's coming closer and closer in certain parts of the country, certain parts of the world, California, Texas, arguably New England it's starting to hint at, certainly Germany, Spain, some of the places around the world. When you get a system that has a lot of renewables, and hopefully renewables augmented by storage and the very responsive demand, the generator quality demand, I think that Mr. McCullough used. I thought that was an interesting phrase. You get that kind of a system that's no longer characterized by a unit of fossil fuel converted to steam, converted to electricity, which creates a very clear marginal cost. When all your energy is coming from the sun and the wind and being stored overnight, what is a locational marginal price? What is that energy price? How does the system work? And how do we structure the economic framework around that so that we continue to get reliable and robust operations and dispatch? And how do we use that as another input to the investment thesis so that we continue to sustain and build out these kind of renewable and clean resources? So those two are sort of down the road issues, but I don't want people to lose sight of the fact that this accommodate discussion is only the first step. So with that, appreciate your time, and I'll turn it over to Marissa.
Thank you. I want to thank Great Plains and Nicholas Institute for asking me to participate in this panel today. I appreciate the opportunity to provide a state perspective. Coming from the Maryland Commission, I just want to say at the outset, the Maryland Commission has not yet taken a position on any of the 9 proposals. I have no idea what the task force is named, so I'm not going to try. But we have not yet taken a position on any of the proposals pending before it. And I think I think while I would normally start this presentation by saying these views that I express here may not capture the Maryland Commission's views. What I think I really should say is they probably won't capture all the other states' views too as well. I don't want to leave you with the impression that the comments I'm about to offer are demonstrative of all the states' positions. In fact, I think I found myself agreeing in part and disagreeing in part with some of the remarks made by my colleagues on the first panel, even those pursuing similar initiatives to what Maryland is pursuing right now. And I think that that's a really important observation to make at the beginning when considering the question of why we're going down this path, and more importantly, whether we should go down this path. I want to pick up where Chairman Hawk left off this morning in asking why and whether, and remarking that states have had existing markets and initiatives for decades now. I'd posit much longer than the PJM market has been around. And when we get into this discussion of accommodate and mitigate and other things like that, I'd rather turn it on its head and ask whether participants in that market have considered that states have accommodated the federal markets in crafting our policies. For example, Maryland, and I'm sure I didn't have the benefit of being able to see Kathleen's slide, but I'm sure the Maryland offshore wind project was on there, and if not, it probably should have been by the definitions that have been offered here today. For those of you that don't know, the Maryland Commission approved two offshore wind incentives for 2 offshore wind projects earlier this year, totaling almost 400 megawatts. In modeling and going through our evidentiary process to consider that state subsidy for a specific generation type, we certainly took into account the impact on the PJM market, and we certainly found a way to accommodate that market as vis-a-vis our state initiatives. So I just want to put that out there as food for thought, whether the conversation should always revolve around whether the federal markets should be accommodating states, and whether you've considered if states are accommodating the federal markets. Mr. Fuller can certainly correct me if I'm misstating, but I think what he seemed to imply at one point in his remarks was that when the states decided to participate in PJM, and I'm sure this is a gross mischaracterization, but it came off as almost suggesting that we had ceded our authority to craft a generation mix by participating in these federal markets. And what I'd say is, the Maryland state legislature certainly would take issue with that. They spent 3 years debating the offshore wind legislation, which brings me to my next point, noting that in the problem statement that PJM has offered on this issue, and Darlene can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that it references perhaps a failure to anticipate what the states are up to. I'd also posit that given it took us 3 years to pass that legislation, several years after that to do regs, evidentiary process, it will take several years after this for a federal BOEM process. All in all, I think that there were 10 years in there before offshore wind's going to come online. And to me, given that we've worked through these stakeholder processes in sometimes less than 18 months, 10 years from the state side is perhaps a stark comparison to consider. Sorry. So again, I'd like to echo the earlier comments about considering why, noting that while perhaps this is a somewhat unexpected comment from a state that is a founding member of RGGI, certainly our state has strong environmental goals and initiatives such as the carbon pricing proposal, which we'll hear about later, as well as the capacity repricing. Those may seem to align with our state goals, and like Kathleen, I applaud the leadership that PJM's shown in in trying to pursue such initiatives. But you know, I think that before we got to the point of crafting this proposals, it perhaps could have benefited from a discussion more about the why at the state level. And in finding that perhaps all of our states couldn't reach a consensus on the why, perhaps that could have provided insight into the weather question. So just want to conclude by saying with all of those remarks, again, we have not yet taken a position on the proposals that are currently pending. Certainly I've offered you some food for thought about whether I think the capacity construct, I would adopt some of the language offered at lunch with this being an administrative construct as opposed to some of the state markets and initiatives that we've pursued. I've offered you some food for thought there, and I'm sure I've generated questions. I'll turn it over.
Well, thanks to each of you. That certainly gives us a whole lot to chew on. I want to start by kind of spending a little bit more time on that why question that has come up many times today. And Darlene, really appreciate you taking some time at the beginning of your talk to talk about PJM's motivations for the proposal that you've put forward. And I really appreciated Pete's dishwasher loading analogy because my husband and I also cannot load the dishwasher together. He tells me that I really just shouldn't do it at all because my way is not right in the least. But you know, Kathleen and Marissa both noted, perhaps in their remarks, that states have had incentive programs for many years. Perhaps they've been handing cups and plates to go into the dishwasher, or at least, you know, forks and knives, or, you know, smaller items for some time. So I'd really love to hear, you know, Darlene, your thoughts and others on what might be different about some of the policies that we've seen states considering or pursuing in recent years, or hypothetical future policies that we might see coming down the line. What's different? Why and why now? If you can unpack that a little bit for us.
Sure. I guess I'll start with what we think about this. This is why the whole discussion on materiality is important. We recognize that different credits have, you know, smaller subsidies have been happening for years. What we're seeing today, or what folks are contemplating or states are contemplating, we see it on a whole new level. That's why we are saying today is a materiality question for us. Now, having said that, I think one of the things that Kathleen brought out is the trigger. And I think that goes hand in hand with you know, and to some degree on this question of material. What's big enough to cause us to, you know, sticking with the dishwasher analogy, what is that big old pot that would drive us to say we got to do something different with this? I'm not saying that PJM has figured out all of the answers. I mean, that's why we certainly need everyone at the table. We put forth one thing to consider as we consider the trigger. One thing that Kathleen mentioned that I thought was really good is that everything you said was good. Oh, not to imply nothing else is good, but you know, one thing that I caught on, I think that one place where we really agree is the actual repricing approach. I think where we kind of move apart is the trigger. And the way that we kind of think about it, or the way I'm thinking about it now, is the trigger, if we think about it as a spectrum, you know, with, you know, I think Kathleen and being on one side and maybe PJM being here and maybe some others being over here with doing nothing. The question is, where ought we be on this spectrum that is the repricing trigger? Is it where we hit the cost of new entry that would be detrimental to folks thinking about building where it might impact resource adequacy. Should we do it before we get to that point? So I think it is where we disagree really is the spectrum, or what we call the trigger for doing something.
Yeah, I'll just chime in to agree with that. In large part, I think the thing that troubles me when we talk about smaller subsidies versus larger subsidies, I just think we should look at the facts. I mean, Marissa mentioned the offshore wind contracts, $134 a megawatt hour.
$131.93.
Yeah. So the ZEC again, $11.50. I don't think that's in my view, if that were material, then one set would be impacted and another wouldn't. But I'm not sure why that's the trigger. Again, I think the trigger should be tied to the purpose of the market, and if the market is not achieving its goals, then we should be considering this. If it is, then we shouldn't. So, but otherwise, I agree the way Darlene framed it. That's the spectrum of opportunities that is in front of stakeholders and ultimately in front of PJM, because no one's betting that there's going to get a stakeholder, a majority vote for any of these proposals.
So I picked up from your questions here two things, the why and the why now. And I actually think, in Chairman Hawk's remarks, I kept going back and forth thinking whether I understood the why or not. I think there's really two whys there. One is, why are states doing what they're doing? And I think that has to do with all the background stuff I was talking about and where we are just in a policy world. And then why would we do anything in the markets to react to that? And again, I think we've addressed that a little bit, but I think those are two really interesting whys going on there. As far as the why now, I think Darlene or somebody kind of picked up on it. When it's a fork here and there, it's not a big deal. You're like, it's not right, but it's okay, we can manage it. But when it's that big mixing bowl with the chocolate chip cookie batter going right in the middle, it's like, that's really hard to manage around. It's going to make a difference. It's changing the scope and scale of things. So I think that's the trigger, not in my mind, because I've always thought we should have clear protections so that the markets act like markets, like commercial entities. But for the broader conversation to be happening, which I think is very helpful. In terms of the triggers, which is a slightly different question, I think I again take a little bit of a different view than Darlene and PJM and Kathleen. It's not about materiality or when does it matter. It just matters. It matters all the time, because whether it's an offshore wind project that's being supported by the state or a nuclear unit that's being supported by the state, it has similar effects, because the larger corrosive effect is, do we really have a market here? Is investment really welcome here on a private basis for a risk taker? That's the effect we want to stay away from. So we look at the triggers for when to act as being pretty strict and pretty stringent, but we think in the long run what that does, once we get to the next step of including these things in the market, is it creates a lot of confidence and a lot of encouragement for the private investors to come, bring that innovation, the private capital, take the risk off of ratepayers, so we get offshore wind and other renewables and clean energy that we want, get it through the most efficient mechanism we can have. And by the way, I did not mean to suggest that states completely ceded control over generation. I understand. I'm not a lawyer, but I've heard enough about that. My point simply being that the markets really are designed to be self-contained and to bring forth the reliable mix, and it seemed to me, at least for many of the states, were very comfortable with that for a long time. So.
Thank you. So Marissa, I want to pick up on something that you said in your remarks, which I think is important, which was that you might not necessarily, states in PJM might have different views on this proposal and others, and without asking you to specifically point out, I disagree with this person on X or Y. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you see states having difficulty kind of coming together, or where you might see divergences in views on some of these proposals, or
Sure.
between you and your colleagues.
Sure. So I think that's a great lead back to the previous question about why, and again restating that why we think that making a change to this market would help to accommodate state goals without knowing whether there is a collective, aggregate, agreed upon set of state goals. And I think the obvious answer to that is no. Even the similarly situated states, and I'll pick on my friends in Delaware, and I will name, I mean, we're both RGGI states. That doesn't mean that we try to incentivize our environmental policies under the RGGI umbrella in the same way, although we may have similar goals. I think the first panel did a good job as well about pulling out that each state, even if they have similar environmental goals, may be going about it and justifying it, like co-justifying it in different ways. Maryland's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act requires that there be a positive net economic benefit and net job increase along with any environmental mitigation strategies that we pursue. So I think that there could be clashes in trying to correct what is perceived as a problem in the existing market today without having an agreed upon. If you're trying to take a step back and say and view this from the idea that states are acting because the markets aren't, which is a premise that I think I fundamentally disagree with. But even if you start there without having a 13, 14 state agreement about what policy that we're trying to pursue and how, I'm just not sure that any of these proposals could be successful in preventing states from continuing to act in the future or mitigate our actions. Again, I perhaps would have chosen different words than mitigate or accommodate, but I'll leave it there.
No, thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I want to make sure that we have time to get the room involved. So get ready with your questions, and maybe Franz can find the microphone and be ready. But I want to come back also to, Pete, something you said toward the end of your comments, which is that this is really a first step. And the idea that well, maybe we need to be thinking about achieving other sorts of state goals through the markets, but also if we're looking even farther off into the future as we have more renewable resources, more low marginal cost resources in the market, maybe the market needs to look different in order to send the right incentives, ensure reliability under those circumstances. So I'm curious how you're thinking about that in the context of some of these, or thinking about the nearer term issues in the context of that longer term vision. Does that inform the way you're thinking about changes that are needed to the capacity market near term? Is it a wholesale redesign of the markets that's needed longer term, or is that something that we're kind of taking steps toward today? And then Darlene and others, I'm curious if you're thinking along the same lines, or if that's something that's just kind of farther off into the future.
So I think the, actually Marissa highlighted one of the major issues in what I see as sort of the next step, what has been dubbed Achieve, for those of you who watched the FERC technical conference or were there, is what is it that we ought to build into the markets to, to do some of the things, or all of the things, hopefully, that the states are currently trying to do. And I think it's very hard to get agreement across a multi-state region, certainly one as diverse as PJM. We've had that problem in New England as well. Those 6 states can't agree on what the objectives are. And it really ties back to the point that Marissa called me out on, which is that at base, the states want to be able to say, I have the authority to do what I want to do. And, it just is. And I think that's where this first step I do see as extraordinarily important and hopefully robust, so that whether it's a PJM solution or our solution or something else, that's always in place, so that as states continue to act, you can still manage getting those resources into the market, achieving some revenues, getting some recognition of those within the market framework, but do it in a way that, again, doesn't swamp the market and overshadow the what we hope will continue to be a private investment game. As far as the longer term, I don't have the silver bullet, and I'm not sure there is one, but I would argue that some of the things we're seeing today, at least as far as I can see, are some of the things we're seeing today are pieces of that puzzle. And I'd say that, you know, capacity performance is one of them, because it's not just capacity for capacity's sake. It's capacity, but you get rewarded or penalized if you're there or not there at the wrong time. You know what I mean? So when you perform, how you perform is extremely important. So that kind of performance-linked stuff is important. We're hearing having a lot of discussions in various parts of the country about flexibility, ramping, the ability to adapt and respond to outages or transitions in renewable variable output. Storage obviously is a key player there, and how do we get markets to take into account and value the kind of immediate responsiveness and capabilities that storage has? How do we take advantage at a grid level of the kind of distributed control that's now made available by instantaneous communications, you know, all over the place, the cloud computing capability, all of the kind of quick stuff that was unthinkable 10 or 15 years ago is really becoming possible now in terms of knowing what's going on and managing it. So I don't think there is one answer to that long term, but I think it's a blend of all of that stuff. Is big data and the cloud, and I mean, it's all that techie stuff. Is how do you actually manage it to work better together?
Great.
Now, can I just add one point on that question? Because, you know, we have decided that we're going to talk in this panel about this accommodate concept, mitigation concept.
True.
The morning panel was about looking forward, and to Pete's credit, part of his comments were about looking forward. The afternoon panel is absolutely about looking forward. This panel is about, we want to try and stop the states at the moment so that we can have that longer term discussion. And I just don't understand why figuring out how to achieve needs to be longer term. We are spending a tremendous amount of time in this task force, in these discussions, on this issue. I mean, there's a session every week, there's poll questions, there's deadlines, there's proposals, and we're not spending time on the achieve. That's why I'm so excited Doug invited me to this event, because maybe not today, but when you kick all of us out and you have your meeting tomorrow, you know, you guys are the perfect group to talk about that achieve question and how we can move forward and solve the problem that we're all sitting here wringing our hands about, so that we do have certainty for Pete's company to invest and others. But we're not doing that because we're spending all our time on trying to solve this problem that, as I said earlier, I'm not sure is really at a point where it needs addressing at this point.
Can I just add one more thing?
Sure.
So a couple of things. One, I want to go back to the state question, the different varying. You know, from where we sit, there are a number of different reasons why states may not necessarily agree on where we are or where we should go. I mean, it depends on the fuel mix in the state, whether or not the states are net importers or net exporters, and even the political climate in a state matters about, you know, can influence what a state might think about any or all of this. So that's one point I want to make sure that we made. And to Kathleen's point, I think Kathleen makes a really good point. I think now is the time that we probably ought to be thinking about action sooner than later. And one of the things I wanted to make sure that I remind folks about when you talk about, you know, even the longer term, one of the things that we did, you know, several months ago was perform an analysis on the fuel mix to see whether or not there would be issues with increased levels of gas, different types of renewables. And what we did was just looked at all of the reliability criteria of each different fuel type, and then we put portfolios of potential future fuel mixes together and said, based on these portfolios and the resource or the reliability criteria of each of the different types of fuel mix, do we think we will have a problem from a reliability perspective? We didn't see any big problems. I mean, I think we hit a certain point on renewable penetration where we thought we may run into some issues. But in general, the answer was no, which is why we moved to the next question. Okay, so what do we need to do today? What are those big so whats then? And one of the things was resilience, thinking more about with the existing fuel mix, you know, with gas or different things, should we be thinking about you know, pipelines and different things like that. Now, that's not a discussion for today, but I just wanted to point out that those are some of the things that we're doing today to try to think about things long-term, in addition to trying to move the ball forward on some of the things that we know about today.
Great. I want to make sure we have time for all of your questions. Anybody want to jump in here?
Thank you. Good afternoon. Ali Mirza Khalili here from Delaware. I love Mr. Fuller's analogy of dishwasher, and we have the problem solved in our home. My wife cooks, I load the dishwasher, and when she burns a dish that has heavy carbon deposit, I don't put that in the dishwasher. We just leave that out. I think that's our solution. But
thanks for the
talking about, you know, how to address, you know, removing externalities and putting that into the equation of pricing. The state's goals are important environmental goals. The way we try to advance those goals is by pricing that into the market. So if you are looking to undo that, are you considering capturing the entire life cycle cost of fuel into that as a, you know, for instance, there's a carbon cost, there's a cost of SO2, health impact costs. Those are, you know, some of us think that those are subsidized, and those are external costs that are not internalized to the market. Would your plan be able to accommodate that so we can get a true cost of all the subsidies?
Well, I think that's what our carbon proposal that you'll hear about on the next section is meant to do. I mean, we talked about ways that we could start to incorporate or price externalities into the market so that they are inclusive. Certainly that's not something that we can decide to do on our own. I think it's kind of skirting on the edges of the scope that we've been given at the federal level. However, if we work together with the states and others to come up with methods, to come up with the attributes or externalities that ought to be part of the market, and we can agree, then certainly that's something that we would be open to.
As an environmental agency, we actually intervened in a rate case in our state, trying to capture the externality cost into when they said lowest cost, and that gets really complicated when you import and attributes aren't associated with the, you know, block of megawatts that you purchase.
Right.
But I think with the current technology that we have, you know, the cloud and our ability to track, I don't see why the carbon pricing is separated from this. Why aren't we all talking about market solution all at the same time?
Well, I thank you for your comments. I appreciate that it was emphasized how there's going to be regional differences and how a state is going to need to interact with the issue. And, you know, one of the foremost differences is whether you're in a regulated versus non-regulated state environment. And since the PJM is mostly in the non-regulated, I recognize that there's going to be a takeaway somewhat different than what we might be looking at in our companies in the MISO area, and we're here to learn from your perhaps pioneering a little bit ahead of the pace where we're at. But with that said, I think I'd like to emphasize that there are environmental attributes that are being worked in and being recognized now, but the reliability and resiliency attributes that we've been basically enjoying as a attachment to traditional resources perhaps are not getting recognized, so that when you go into solution development, that that's really what it's about, is how do we provide for a system that can support the frequency, the voltage, the reactive power, the responses to distributed generation on a holistic way in a market that really is just currently designed to support a least cost operational dispatch. Thanks.
When we did the fuel cost analysis, that's one of the questions that came out of that as well. So when we looked at all of the different reliability attributes, all of the things that NERC require, in addition to the things that we look at in our control room, one of our takeaways from that as well was, are there certain reliability attributes that we should be pricing in our market? So that's one of the questions that we're asking ourselves as well, to your point.
Hi, thanks everyone for creating this panel. It's been really interesting. My name's Stephanie Gourmet. I'm with Capstone. We're a policy research firm for institutional investors. And my question, I think, is for Darlene. Do you need consensus for your capacity construct public policy stakeholder group in order for that policy to be enacted and be submitted to FERC? One. Number two, are you trying to do that before the capacity auctions in 2018? Three, if there is no consensus, could PJM go ahead and submit such the repricing policy to FERC anyway? And then lastly, for anyone on the panel that wants to talk about it, FERC, the new FERC, new temporary FERC chair, Chatterjee's talking about compensating on-site fuel resources through either some kind of a on-site fuel revenue stream or something of the like. I'm wondering if you guys have any color to add on how that dovetails with today's discussion on base load and the out-of-market payments.
All right, I had to write these down so I didn't forget this multi-part question. The first question was around consensus. Our governance requires consensus for PJM to make a 205 filing at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And it is through that mechanism that we would affect changes to our markets. So yes, we do require consensus at the stakeholder level. As far as timing is concerned, timing was actually written into the issue charge of the capacity CCPP STF. And in that issue charge, it was the desire to have a method approved in time for the 2018 capacity auction. Now, whether or not that actually happens remains to be seen, but yes, that is certainly one of our goals. The third question you asked is whether or not we can file if we have no consensus. Our board of directors do have some leeway in making a choice to file, and I think they have done that in times where it's been really on the border as far as voting is concerned. But they don't take that lightly. And so whether or not we would actually file something if we got no consensus just remains up in the air.
That was beautifully done.
Ah, thank you.
I know that question came up at this week's CCPP SDF meeting, and Stu danced around it, but you did a great job answering the question. Yeah, I'll tell him that. So Stephanie, I'll take your last question. Some of you know I used to work at FERC. When I was there, I did not purport to speak for the chairman, so I'm certainly not going to do it now that I don't work at FERC. I'll just speculate that a discussion about on-site fuel is really getting to this last point about resiliency and how the system can respond when we have some common failure mode event, we have some terroristic attack or extreme weather event, and if you have units that have fuel on site or that don't require refueling, which is the case with the nuclear fleet, but for every 2 years, that might be something that goes into a resiliency type of analysis. How it dovetails with today's discussion, I don't think it does just yet. I mean, I think we haven't really talked about, other than maybe during lunch, we had a little bit of a back and forth on it. How would you go about valuing that? And we could have a whole other session on that, whether it's through some sort of adder in the energy market. How would you quantify that? Lots of questions to be answered there. Or through some sort of separate demand curve in the capacity market. I think those are all things that I imagine the chairman is thinking about when he talks about valuing it, but at least I haven't heard any sort of fully formed proposal for how to achieve that.
And I certainly have even less insight into the chairman's thinking on this, but from my perspective, when I hear somebody talk about valuing on-site fuel or even valuing carbon in some respects, we're talking about attributes. We're talking about certain characteristics of some generation or some resource, some energy source. And I think there are a number of ways to think about valuing attributes. And I might, before I'm finished here, opine on what I think is a good way versus some of the bad ways. But first of all, you have to figure out what it is, and I think, and talk about how much you need and why you need it. And so there's a lot of discussion that needs to go on around that. But I think the time is right, frankly, with the DOE report and the fuel and resiliency and so forth, with all the carbon discussions around carbon. There's a good time for that. I think first and foremost, you have to think about, am I buying an attribute of reliable fuel, or do I really just want to maintain some coal plants? Those are very different things, and we have to have those kind of conversations. And I think there are, in my experience, we've been talking about this actually on a number of levels for a number of years, and there is a model in New England for what we call forward reserves, which I think is actually a good template to think about, which is there's capacity, or there are resources, and there are certain ones that have this extra characteristic of quick response. And let's define a requirement for that quick response. And so certain resources that qualify can participate and compete for that. And it creates another point of value. And what it does for the ISO, for the system, is it says, I know, because I have a purchase agreement, essentially, with these resources, I know I have access to that when I need reserves. Likewise, I think if you did something like that, it'd say, I know I have access to on-site fuel, for example. I know I have access to low-carbon energy, whatever the attribute is we're talking about. But it's an add-on. It's a special premium on top of your standard adequacy kind of capacity, for example. So I think there are ways to think about it, but I think ultimately or initially it comes back to, what do you want? Let's talk about it. How do you define it? Why is it valuable? Why is it important? How much do you need? Those kind of questions are pretty key up front.
Okay, so I think we're about at time. I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative to ask one final lightning round question to each of our panelists. In 3 words or less, if we could just do one thing to make the markets and state policies work better together, what would we do?
I can do it in 2.
I can do it in 1.
You go for it.
Collaborate.
Oh, she's so good. I would say price carbon.
2-tier pricing. It's hyphenated.
Yeah, you got it. You got it.
Leave us alone.
That's excellent.
Touche.
Well done.
All right, thanks everybody for a great discussion. Kathleen took the bait. We're going to talk about carbon pricing when we come back.